Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Friday, June 9th, 2023. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. Republican senators introduce the End Endless War Act. So, a group of Republican senators on Thursday introduced a bill to repeal the 2001 authorization for the use of military force, the AUMF, that was passed in the wake of the September 11th attacks and is still being used to justify wars today. So, the End Endless Wars Act was introduced by Senators Rand Paul, Mike Lee, J.D. Vance, and Mike Braun. The legislation would repeal the 2001 AUMF 180 days after its enactment. So Senator Paul said in a statement, quote, "If there exists any desire to reclaim our constitutional power and send a message to the world that we are a nation of peace, Congress should pass this bill and repeal the 2001 authorization for war. After all, the 2001 AUMF never intended to authorize worldwide war all the time, everywhere, forever." End quote. So Senator Lee said that the 2001 AUMF, quote, "has become one of the many instruments of misuse, and it is time for members of Congress to end this authority that keeps us in endless wars," end quote. So this AUMF, again, that was passed right after 9/11, it currently authorizes war in Syria, Iraq, Somalia, Yemen, and in several other countries, and a lot of countries in Africa. And, these groups that the US is fighting, most of them, in Syria and Iraq, the US is, they use their fight against ISIS to justify that presence and the occupation of Syria. ISIS didn't exist in 2001. And in Somalia, they're fighting Al Shabaab. Al Shabaab also didn't exist in 2001. Their first claimed attack was in 2007. So we're fighting these groups that didn't exist at the time that this authorization was passed. And it really is just a blank check for endless war. So it's good to see that there's a push here from these senators. Now, back in March, Senator Paul tried to include an amendment to a legislation to repeal the 2002 AUMF for Iraq. So the Senate has voted to repeal that 2002 AUMF that was used for the 2003 invasion, which, it looks good, but it's really that's just a symbolic move because the US isn't using that 2002 AUMF to wage war today. So repealing it is they're just doing it kind of as a symbolic gesture to act like they care about reining in presidential war powers, but realistically, it's not going to change anything. In order to end these wars, they need to repeal the 2001 AUMF, and that's why unfortunately, this bill is probably going to fail. But at least there's a push here, and I think it'll do better. So back in March, when the Senate did vote to repeal the Iraq AUMF, Rand Paul introduced an amendment to the legislation to include the 2001 AUMF, and it failed pretty miserably in a vote of 9-86. But I think as a standalone bill, hopefully there's some lobbying and it gets more support. We just get the people talking about actually repealing, actually ending these wars, not just these symbolic gestures. All right, so the next one here, Russia says that it repelled a large Ukrainian attack. So Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu said Thursday that Russian forces repelled a Ukrainian attack in Ukraine's southern Zaporozhye Oblast, as Western media outlets are reporting that Ukraine's counteroffensive has officially begun. So Shoigu said that at 1:30 a.m. early Thursday morning, Ukraine made an attempt with up to 1,500 troops and 150 pieces of armor from the 47th Mechanized Brigade to break through Russian defenses. He said that this assault was halted and that Ukraine retreated with heavy casualties. He said that Ukraine lost 30 tanks, 11 infantry fighting vehicles, and up to 350 personnel. And, there's no way to confirm those numbers. And Ukrainian leadership is also keeping quiet about its offensive plans. Although there was a lot of reporting, again, in Western media. A U.S. official told the New York Times that it appeared the main thrust of Ukraine's counteroffensive has begun. Some other media outlets cited anonymous Ukrainian officials who said that the counteroffensive has started. And earlier this week, there was also U.S. officials saying that it did look like the Ukrainian counteroffensive started when we saw a lot of attacks in Donetsk in the eastern Donbass region. And there's still fighting going on there. But now, again, Thursday, it was just all over the place saying that this Ukrainian offensive has really started now, although Ukrainian officials are kind of, just not commenting on it. And this is the area, Zaporozhye, and is the area that Ukraine's counteroffensive is expected to be focused on, because they want to sever that land bridge from Crimea to the Russian mainland. So if you're watching the video here, this is a map from South Front. They put out daily battlefield updates, and it shows that there was a Ukrainian attack in this area of Zaporozhye, but really just in that one area. And then again, there was also still fighting in the Donbass region on Thursday as well. So yeah, and as we know, the U.S. and NATO have really helped Ukraine prepare for this counteroffensive. There's reports that U.S. Bradley fighting vehicles and German-made Leopard tanks were spotted near the front lines. There's some unconfirmed reports that some of the Leopard tanks were destroyed in this attempted offensive here. So, this is a NATO equipped, a NATO trained, using NATO intelligence. NATO, the US and NATO are doing everything short of killing the Russians for Ukraine, everything short of that. So it's hard to argue that, when the Russians say that they view this war as a war against NATO. They are saying that NATO is directly involved, which has an implication that if they chose to, they have the pretext to, launch an attack on a NATO country, which is very scary. All right, the next one here. A Russian official says that the U.S. pressured Ukraine not to sign a peace deal. So this is Nikolai Patrushev. He is the secretary of the Russian Security Council. On Thursday, he said that Ukraine was ready to sign a peace deal with Russia in the early days of the war, but gave up on negotiations due to U.S. pressure. He said, quote, "Had it not been for the U.S. pressure on those whom they installed at the head of Ukraine, this situation would not have happened. Even the Ukrainian leaders themselves were ready for signing a peace treaty and gave Russia written proposals that we, in principle, approved," end quote. He said that there are interested parties interested in continuing this conflict, mainly the U.S. and the U.K. And so in this article, I kind of rehash the early days of the war when there was negotiations going on. So I'll just go through some of that. I know this is something I've covered a lot, but there might be new people listening, and I think it's worth to mention this, from time to time, that there were negotiations between the Ukraine and Russia in the early days of the war. In March 2022, toward the end of that month, Russian and Ukrainian officials met in Istanbul for in-person talks. And according to the account of former U.S. officials speaking to Foreign Affairs, the two sides agreed on a framework for a tentative deal that would have involved a Russian withdrawal in exchange for Ukrainian neutrality. There were other details, that needed to be worked out, but something was really on the table. And we've seen Russia say that this was the case, including Putin said it. But in April 2022, Boris Johnson traveled to Kiev, and he urged Zelensky not to negotiate with Russia. He said that himself when he spoke with Macron about his trip to Kiev, that he urged against negotiating with Russia when he was there. And according to Ukrainska Pravda, which is a Ukrainian newspaper, Johnson said that even if Zelensky was ready to sign a deal with Putin, Kiev's Western backers were not. And the report said that at the time, Russia was ready for a Putin-Zelensky meeting, but that possibility came to a halt after Johnson's visit. Naftali Bennett, who was the Israeli prime minister when war first broke out in Ukraine, when this phase of the war first broke out, He was trying to mediate between Putin and Zelensky also in March 2022 before the Istanbul talks, and he gave a similar account of the Western position. He said that the US and its allies blocked his mediation effort and that he thought there was a legitimate decision by the West to keep striking Putin and not negotiate. So after the peace talks fell apart in April 2022, Turkey's foreign ministers said, again, they hosted the peace talks in Istanbul. He said that he expected the conflict to end after those talks, but then realized after a NATO summit that some countries in NATO wanted to prolong the war to weaken Russia. He specifically said weaken Russia. And just a few days after that, Lloyd Austin, the US Secretary of Defense, admitted that one of the US goals in Ukraine was to weaken Russia. And then right after that, Congress passed that big $40 billion Ukraine aid package. And, we know the rest. So, again, maybe a little redundant that I'm going over this, but I think it's important to bring up. And as we know, the Biden administration is still very opposed to the idea of peace talks, with Blinken, railing against the idea of a ceasefire. All right, the next one here. This is from Declassified UK. Russian neo-Nazi fighting Putin was taught at a British far-right camp. So this is the leader of that Russian Volunteer Corps, which is a neo-Nazi group of ethnic Russians or people from Russia. There might be some Ukrainians in there too. I'm not sure, but they're openly neo-Nazi, white nationalists, and they've been attacking Russian territory. They've been leading these raids in Belgorod, and they're armed with NATO equipment, with U.S. armored vehicles, NATO rifles. These are the type of people that are ending up with these weapons. And this report found that the leader, he goes by a few names, Denis Kaputstin or Denis Nikitin, also known as White Rex, which is also the name of his white nationalist clothing line. Apparently, he was an instructor at a far-right camp in Wales in 2014. And this just goes over some of the things he said. I mean, completely, not, white, again, ethno supremacist, white nationalist, whatever you want to call it, very extreme. And this is who, is fighting for the Ukrainian government, again, launching these attacks on Russia with NATO weapons. And, there was just one anecdote in here from one of their attacks in Bryansk in Russia. A Muslim child was wounded, and he was mocking the Muslim boy on Telegram or on social media. He said that Russia will be Aryan or lifeless. That was his response to a Muslim boy being wounded in their attack. So that, again, these are the type of people that are ending up with all these weapons. And, there's a lot of bad dudes in these groups. All right, the next one here, this is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. And NATO members continue trading with Russia despite sanctions. So 2 recent reports have uncovered billions in trade between members of the North Atlantic Alliance and Russia after the Kremlin ordered the invasion of Ukraine last year. So basically, these countries, and this goes back to, during the G7 summit, the U.S. wanted to get a complete export ban to Russia. They wanted to basically cut off all trade to Russia, but the EU did not want to go along because, they still have to do some trading. And, this is part of the reality of the situation. The main Western countries behind most indirect exports, apparently that's a lot of what it is indirect exports, were Germany, Lithuania, the United States, Poland, Japan, the Czech Republic, France, and the Netherlands. So it's not just Europe, it's also the US. All right. So the next one here, the US dismisses a report on a Chinese spy base in Cuba. So on Thursday, there was this very scary sounding report from the Wall Street Journal that claimed China and Cuba have reached an agreement to establish a secret Chinese spying facility in Cuba. So this grabbed a lot of headlines, but the Pentagon, both the Pentagon and the White House, have dismissed it, calling it not accurate. So Pentagon spokesman Brigadier General Patrick Ryder said, quote, "I can tell you based on the information that we have that is not accurate. that we are not aware of China and Cuba developing a new type of spy station. In terms of that particular report, no, it's not accurate, end quote. So the White House also dismissed the Wall Street Journal report. John Kirby, the National Security Council spokesman, said it was not accurate. So the Wall Street Journal, they cited anonymous U.S. officials who claimed that China would provide Cuba with billions of dollars as part of the agreement to build an eavesdropping station. The officials claimed that the facility would allow China to gather signals intelligence, known as SIGINT, which could include the monitoring of emails, phone calls, and satellite transmissions. The Soviet Union had a spy station in Cuba throughout the Cold War that was established in 1962, known as the Lord's Sigint Station. It was closed by Russia in 2002. That's just a little history, because I've seen some people try to compare this, believing the Wall Street Journal report, trying to compare it to the Cuban Missile Crisis, to the, similar to nuclear weapons being sent to Cuba, which is just nonsense. So I think it's just important to point out that the Soviets did have, some kind of spying station there after that. So Bob Menendez, who is the hawkish chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, he said that if China establishes a spy facility in Cuba, it would be a direct assault upon the United States. And of course, any Chinese surveillance efforts in the region would be a response to the U.S. constantly running surveillance operations near China, including frequent spy plane flights over the South China Sea. The U.S. is also suspected of having, these signal intelligence capabilities in Taiwan. And Tsai Ming-yen, who is the Director General of Taiwan's National Security Bureau, he just said recently, back in April, that Taiwan now has a real-time intelligence sharing link with the Five Eyes, which is the Western Intelligence Alliance that includes the US, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and Britain. So we always have to keep that stuff in mind when we see reports like this, but it turns out this report doesn't seem to be true. I think if China did do something like this, they wouldn't really get many benefits from it. It would be more of just a statement, kind of a, kind of a just a response to, again, the US doing all their surveillance near their coast. And I didn't put this in the article, but I noticed throughout the day, I mean, all the China hawks, all the Republican China hawks just going nuts over this, even though the White House and the Pentagon said it was not accurate. It's still spread just like wildfire. And they're all saying Blinken shouldn't go to China, so he might cancel his trip again over this. He's at least being pressured to. I mean, it's just complete hysteria over a story that, it makes me wonder if it was kind of coordinated, because I saw that House Committee on China, they put out a statement saying all these things the U.S. should do in response, these sanctions. So maybe these U.S. officials, who are the Wall Street Journal sources, kind of did this, in coordination with the China hawks in Congress. There might be some people in the Biden administration that want Biden to go even harder on China than he is, or want to kind of sabotage this diplomacy that's been going on. I think that's definitely a possibility. All right, the next one here, the U.S., Taiwan, and Japan to share real-time drone surveillance data. So now this is a believable report. This is from the Financial Times that said the U.S., Japan, and Taiwan are preparing to share real-time data from naval surveillance drones in a move that is sure to anger China. So General Atomics is due to deliver 4 MQ-9B Guardian drones to Taiwan in early 2025. That's the maritime version of the MQ-9 Reaper drone, which the U.S. has used to launch airstrikes across the Middle East and Africa. Sources told Financial Times that the U.S. will allow Taiwan to integrate the drones into the same system that the U.S. and Japanese militaries use in the region, allowing real-time data sharing. What was interesting is that a U.S. military official who spoke to the Financial Times acknowledged that Beijing will view the cooperation as escalatory. The official said, quote, "The sharing of data between Japan and Taiwan, between Taiwan and the Philippines, between the U.S. and all three of them is so crucial, but it's also one of the big taboos because China will see it as escalatory," end quote. So that official also mentioned the Philippines. The Philippines weren't mentioned in the report. I don't know if they have these specific MQ-9. I don't think they do, drones. But China, of course, as I'm always covering, has been warning very strongly against recent U.S. steps to increase both military and diplomatic support for Taiwan. The U.S. isn't listening, and we continue to see these steps that the U.S. is taking to increase support. This next one here is some rare, surprising good news. The U.S. and Iran may be close to an interim nuclear deal. So this is according to a report from Middle East Eye. Several outlets have reported something similar at this point, and it said that the U.S. and Iran are near a deal that would reduce Iran's uranium enrichment in exchange for sanctions relief, although it's not certain if a final agreement will be reached. So sources told Middle East Eye that direct talks between U.S. and Iranian officials have been taking place on U.S. soil, which is significant because during the earlier rounds of negotiations that fell apart last year, they were indirect. They were basically being brokered by the EU in Vienna, but this is direct talks on U.S. soil. Significant. President Biden's special envoy for Iran, Robert Malley, has been leading the U.S. delegation, and Iran's delegation has been led by the Iranian ambassador to the United Nations. The Middle East Eye report said that the U.S. was not interested in restoring the original 2015 nuclear deal known as the JCPOA, but an interim agreement is on the table. And the deal would involve Iran stopping enriching uranium at 60%. So they would stop doing that. Iran would also have to continue cooperation with the International Atomic Energy Agency, which they've been doing. And, despite the talking points from the U.S. and Israel, Iran is very transparent about their nuclear program. Unlike Israel, who has a secret nuclear weapons program, the Iranians, again, are just very transparent, and they've been trying to cooperate with the IAEA. In exchange for these Iranian steps, the U.S. would allow Iran to export up to 1 million barrels of oil per day, and Tehran would also be able to access some of its frozen funds. Haaretz first reported the U.S. and Iran were close to a deal and said that Tehran would be able to access about $20 billion of its assets held in South Korea, Iraq, and at the International Monetary Fund. So, of course, this deal is not finalized. Both sides need the approval of their leadership, and President Biden is already coming under pressure from hawks in Congress who are against any sort of diplomacy with Iran or sanctions relief. And of course, they're framing this as the U.S., giving Iran money to Iran when it's their own money that the U.S. has frozen. So I think Biden's going to come under a lot of pressure because Congress is just so hysterical about Iran for the most part. All Republicans are, except for very few. And enough Democrats are. I know Bob Menendez is very hawkish on Iran now, so I don't. Biden might also come under pressure from Democrats not to go through with this. And he's also going to come under pressure from Israel, of course. This next one here, Netanyahu threatens that no deal on Iran will tie Israel's hands. And this is by Connor Freeman. At the Libertarian Institute, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu warned Antony Blinken that no deal the U.S. makes with Iran would prevent Israel from attacking the country over its nuclear program. American and Iranian officials are reportedly engaging in direct negotiations, which I just went over. So Israel is strongly opposed to the JCPOA and basically any deal with Iran, even though they're always complaining about their nuclear activity, the uranium enrichment. And Connor points out that Iran started enriching uranium at 60% in response to Israel bombing their Natanz nuclear facility. They placed explosives in there. That was in April 2021. That was an attempt to sabotage negotiations between the U.S. and Iran. And in response, Iran took the step to increase enrichment to 60%. So all these things Israel complains about is in direct response to things that to them trying to use force against Iran. So, it's just hard to believe that they actually care about the nuclear program and just want to use it as a pretext to go after the Iranians. All right. So the last one here is some very bad news. British High Court rejects Assange's appeal request. This is from Kevin Gostelow over at The Dissenter. So, the United Kingdom's High Court of Justice rejected WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange's appeal against extradition to the United States. A 3-page decision was issued by one judge, Sir Jonathan Swift. Assange waited in detention in His Majesty's Belmarsh prison for nearly a year. The grounds for appeal were submitted to the appeals court in the middle of July 2022. So, very long time. And Gostela quotes some lawyers who say, it shouldn't have taken this long. But so this is just not good news. This is basically one step closer to Assange being extradited to the U.S. So now the next step here, if I understand it correctly, is that so Stella Assange, who was Julian Assange's wife, put out a statement on what the next step is going to be. It looks like they're going to try another appeal. So she said in a statement, quote, "On Tuesday next week, my husband, Julian Assange, will make a renewed application for appeal to the High Court. The matter will then proceed to a public hearing before 2 new judges at the High Court, and we remain optimistic that we will prevail and that Julian will not be extradited to the United States, where he faces charges that could result in him spending the rest of his life in a maximum security prison for publishing true information that revealed war crimes committed by the U.S. government," end quote. And that's why they're going after him, because he exposed information. They're trying to put him away for 175 years using the Espionage Act for doing journalism. And if he is convicted of this, it's going to set the most dangerous precedent for press freedom, for freedom in general in the U.S. and around the world, because the U.S. and the U.K. are in cahoots on this, trying to put Assange away. And I don't think Australia is doing much about it. Their prime minister says that he is, but they're also going along with all this stuff. This military buildup against China. They have real leverage that they could use against the U.S. that I don't think they are. Does seem like there's a big push in Australia's parliament, though, about it, which is a good sign. But that's it for the news for today. Go check out our viewpoints. We have one from Walter Block. "Hypocrisy. Thy name is the Wall Street Journal." Ted Galen Carpenter, writing at the American Conservative, "NATO's farcical Balkans mission." One from Philip Weiss. "Biden aides smear of Roger Waters. The wall performance is slammed at briefing." That's over at Mondo Weiss, and it is about Sam Husseini, how he grilled the State Department about, those smears against Roger Waters. One from Judge Knapp, "State secrets undermine due process." And our spotlight is from Kelly Vlahos over at Responsible Statecraft. "Nord Stream revelations should chasten Ukraine dam hot takes." But that's everything for today. That's everything for the week. You could always support us at antiwar.com/donate. Share this show. Tell your friends about antiwar.com. All that stuff is a big help. Comment, like, and subscribe wherever you watch the video. Follow us on Twitter. Subscribe to our newsletter. All that. But I'll be back after the weekend. I hope everyone has a good one. Thanks for listening.